Okay, so here we are. This is lecture 6 of the Religions of Ancient Israel by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. So what we're going to do is today I want to finish up with the prophets of the 8th century BCE, Amos and Hosea, and go right into the first reform under Hezekiah, and then get to the 7th century BCE and the events leading to the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians and the reform of Josiah. And the material I've given you, we'll get to that, and we'll look at Amos, we'll finish up Amos, and we'll look at a part of Hosea, and Isaiah we'll look at in conjunction with the reform of Hezekiah. And then hopefully we will get to Jeremiah as well, and the rest of the Deuteronomic idea. So we started looking at Amos, and because he is a Judean who prophesies in the north during the time of Jeroboam II, he is a social critic, but as a Judean, he is also heavily critical of the northern religious establishment, the local shrines. In fact, one of the things that may underline Amos's ideology in attacking the northern shrines is that as a Judean, he probably has a certain amount of the Judean royal cult behind him, in the sense that the idea that the Davidic king dynasty is God's chosen, Jerusalem is God's city, the temple is, God's temple. So there certainly is, as a Judean, he kind of brings that as part of his background. But he's not he's not a court prophet, he's not a shrine prophet. He's like he's one of these independents, and that's that's very important, and he's very influential. There's no doubt about it that you see an echo in Jeremiah of some of Amos's prophecies. So long after he died, his prophecies were they obviously some of them had to be recorded somehow, and people were reading them and knew about them. Especially since he prophesied the fall of the northern kingdom, which, of course, gave his prophecies quite a bit of legitimacy because he was right. Okay, so we looked at the first, I believe we looked at the first prophecy on the list here, chapter 2, verses 6 to 11. So let's look at chapter 3 now, verse 13, which is on page 1314. Because this is important as a prophecy, a part of the prophecies against the north, and this one specifically mentions a shrine. Would somebody like to begin reading? It's again on page 1314, chapter 3, verse 13, and just go to the end of the chapter.
Hear this, and warn the house of Jacob, says my Lord God, the God of hosts, that when I punish Israel for its transgressions, I will wreak judgment on the altar of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and shall fall to the ground. I will wreck the winter palace together with the summer palace. The ivory palaces shall be demolished, and the great houses shall be destroyed, declares the Lord.
Okay, so he's specifically against the very ancient shrine at Bethel, which Jeroboam I is reputed to have set up a calf figure, but it may have been predated him. Bethel was originally a Canaanite religious site. It became a very important Israelite religious site, one of the most important in the north, and talks about the horns of the altar. And then notice it talks about wrecking the winter palace, the summer palace, the ivory palace. These are, this is referring to the capital in Samaria. It was not uncommon for the kings to have use of a lot of carved ivory as part of their palace decorations. So again, this is a specific attack on the northern shrine, which, as we will see, is going to get him into a lot of trouble. But take a look, chapter 4, verse 4, and you'll see there again, Irma, you want to read verses 4 and 5 on the next page, 13, 15? Come to Bethel.
Come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and transgress even more. Present your sacrifices the next morning, and your tithes on the third day, and burn a thank offering of leavened bread, and proclaim free will offerings loudly. For you love that sort of thing, O Israelites, declares my Lord.
This is sarcastic.
Wow.
Okay, you got to read this in a sarcastic voice. There's great sarcasm in the Bible, in case you hadn't noticed. But again, Gilgal is another important shrine site. It's not a temple, but it's a shrine. There's a lot of events, that are sacrifices are done at Gilgal in the narratives, in the early narratives, in Joshua and Judges and Samuel's. Gilgal is often a place of assembly and sacrifice, so it's an important cult center and very important in Northern Israelite history. Okay, so now let's take a look at chapter 5.
So he was saying there should be no shrines other than in Jerusalem.
Well, he's attacking all these shrines. And and during the time of Jeroboam II, Israel is at the height of its prosperity and strength, and he's combining a critique of all these shrines with a social critique. In other words, he sees inequality in society, and he sees a lot of improper religious practices. So if you take a look on
Can I ask a general question?
Yeah.
I understand that the root here is from the ritual into some kind of a centralized.
Yeah, that's what he's.
But this is criticism against not being centralized, or because it's the wrong type of. Let's say if they were all, the tzitzit were completely blue.
Yeah, right.
Would it be okay with
right.
that?
No, the point is that I think it's a combination of both. In other words, he doesn't like what they're doing, and he definitely is leaning towards the idea that they are not doing proper worship. Whether he's explicitly saying they should all be shut down, we haven't seen that yet in Amos. But he's saying they're all going to be destroyed.
Is there a political agenda there hidden?
No, it's a social, religious agenda. It's against compromising a stricter form of monotheism than is practiced in the North.
Then is practiced.
Well, in other words,
South.
yeah. Well, he's not talking about the South.
No, but
yeah.
say it again.
The way I see the Cantor's question is there an agenda that Amos, want to make the South the center, or is it a political diatribe against the North?
See, Amos has no political status. He's just a
purist.
He's a farmer, and a herder who gets hit by the Spirit of God and starts to prophesy against the immorality he sees in the North, what we would call ritual and ethical immorality. And because he is a part of this Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh first group, he is definitely, remember, the North hasn't fallen yet, so he is the one of the background to what becomes the Deuteronomic Revolution. In other words, he's one of the people who are the influences on what will become the Deuteronomic Revolution. Okay?
Like precursor for.
Yeah, he's a precursor. He's a precursor of it.
Was he in the North? Physically?
Yes, he went physically to the North.
If he had been in the South and he hadn't liked what he saw in the South, he would have had a diatribe.
Yeah, well, he would have if he saw improper practices. Yeah, but he didn't, so we don't know. Maybe he did, but we didn't preserve it. He exclusively is talking about the North, and his message is, you blew it. God is going to destroy it all. There's no turning back, and he ended up being right. Okay, so chapter 5, he talks about.
His original Tekoa is near Jerusalem.
Yeah, he's a
So
Judean.
he's from Judea.
He goes into the North. Anyway, the point is, in the beginning of chapter 5, he talks about the destruction. He tells the house of Israel, don't seek Bethel, don't Gilgal. Again, he talks about the destruction of these shrines. The really interesting part of him is a quasi-narrative section in chapter 7. So go to chapter 7, verse 10, because now we have a bit of a narrative added to this. This is on page 1322. Irma, you want to pick it up, start in verse 10 and go to the end of the chapter.
Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent this message to King Jeroboam of Israel. Amos is conspiring against you within the house of Israel. The country cannot endure the things he is saying. For Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel shall be exiled from its...
So here it is, the chief priest of Bethel, one of the most important shrines of the north, is obviously a guy with a lot of, political connections and power, and he sends a message to the king saying, Amos is a traitor. He's running around and telling everybody that, you're going to die by the sword and the house of Israel will be exiled from its soil. This is a troublemaker.
What is
Okay.
El?
Bethel.
House of El. What is El? Do you know?
No, Bethel is the shrine.
I thought it was Beth. Doesn't that mean House of El?
Yeah, it means the house of El. It was originally a Canaanite shrine to the god El, but it became a shrine to God, and the name stuck.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, read on.
Amaziah also said to Amos, Seer, off with you to the land of Judah. Earn your living there, and do your prophesying there. But don't ever prophesy again at Bethel, for it is a king's sanctuary and a royal palace.
In other words, Judean, get the heck out of, and he calls him, he's insulting. He calls him a chozeh, a seer, a fortune teller, right? Go do your business somewhere else. You can't do it around here at Bethel. This is a king's sanctuary, a royal palace. In other words, this is the shrine of the king. Read on.
Amos answered Amaziah, I am not a prophet, and I am not a prophet's disciple. I am a cattle breeder and a tender of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me away from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go, prophesy to my people Israel. And so, hear the word of the Lord. You say I must not prophesy about the house of Israel, or preach about the house of Isaac. But this I swear is what the Lord said. Your wife shall play the harlot in the town. Your sons and daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be divided up with a measuring line. And you yourself shall die on unclean soil, for Israel shall be exiled from its soil.
Now notice he says, I'm not a professional prophet. I am not a professional prophet. I am a cattle breeder and a tender of sycamore trees, right? But it was God that did it. Amos has a famous saying, when God speaks, who can but prophesy, right? If God speaks to you, you can't help it, okay? So here is a confrontation at Bethel between a Judean prophet who is against what is going on in the north. Again, this is part of the backdrop to what comes later, and he's predicting the fall of the north. Now, he's predicting it's going to happen during the time of Jeroboam II, which it doesn't. It happens later. But the point is, this is why we have the book of Amos, because he ended up being right. Okay, so let's look at a northern prophet now, who is one of the most important for the development of the Deuteronomic school, and that's the prophet Hosea. And here we want to go back to the beginning of Hosea on page 1273. Now, the book of Hosea is one of the most, the text of the book of Hosea is one of the most corrupt in the Hebrew Bible. It's extremely difficult to... 1273. It's extremely difficult to translate because of that. There's a lot of emendations, and evidently the corruption goes way, way back because the translators of it in the Septuagint also didn't know what to make of most of the words that they were having problems with. The other thing is we don't know really where Amos refers to very specific events that you can sort of track. Hosea does not. It's very hard to say exactly what he's talking about when, but his message is pretty evident. His life becomes a metaphor for his message, by the way. But he introduces the possibility, unlike Amos, of return, the idea of repentance, which becomes a huge theme in the Deuteronomic school, that yes, you might be destroyed, you might be exiled, this town, but you might come back if you repent. And this is extremely important. And we know that Hosea had a big influence on Jeremiah because we can see the linguistic connections. So again, here's a guy whose prophecies are preserved and read by later people or heard by later people and have an influence on the emergence of what becomes the Deuteronomic revolution. And he's a little, it depends on who you read in terms of dating, but he's later than a little later than Amos, although they probably overlap because they're in the same. Again, it's a question of when they prophesied versus when they lived. Hosea starts during the latter years of Jeroboam II, and in fact goes almost to the end of the northern kingdom. If you take a look at the chart, you'll see that. Whereas Amos is his prophecies are much earlier during the time of Jeroboam II. So let's take a look at a little bit of Hosea. So again, look at the beginning of it, because this tells you when he prophesied. Okay? Now this title is a little bit inaccurate. On the one hand, it fits the southern ones, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So according to this, he overlaps with Hezekiah. But in fact, we know that, but then it says Jeroboam. We know, in fact, that he overlaps with the later kings of Israel as well. So one of his big things is his life is his metaphor. He marries a woman who is a prostitute and has children with her, and then she abandons him to go back to her trade, but eventually he takes her back. And his life becomes a metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel. Okay? So if you take a look at chapter 2.
Why would God tell him to get a wife of whoredom?
Because that's, one of the things is prophets often do what we would call performance art. In other words, they would do symbolic acts. So this is a symbolic act.
So he's doing something to bring a woman back into righteousness?
No, his followers would look at him and listen to the message and see his life as part of his message. It's really, he's highly unusual in that regard. I mean, many of the prophets do symbolic public acts like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but this is the first time that actually involves marrying somebody as part of that symbolic act. So, but take a look at chapter 2, verse 4 on 1274. This sets his whole theme of the, actually we'll start with verse, start with verse 4. Hold it, wait a second. No, look at 2, no, I didn't want to do that part. Look at 2:15, chapter 2, verse 15.
Thus I will punish her.
Yeah, thus I will punish her for the days of the Balalim on which she brought them offerings when decked, in other words, what's going on in the north, according to Hosea, is a form of spiritual adultery. That he's making a link between human adultery, faithlessness to the covenant, and violence. And this is a very important concept that he develops. This idea that what's going on in the north is spiritual adultery, that's the metaphor. Okay, what I really want to do is go to chapter 4. This will give us a better sense of what he's doing here. So if you go to chapter 4, we're going to start at the beginning. That's at 1277 at the bottom. Sam, you want to read it?
Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of this land, because there is no honesty and no goodness.
Now, here, case means a legal case. Mm-hmm. He's using the legal terminology that God is bringing Israel to court for their sins. Go on.
And no obedience to God in the land. False swearing, dishonesty, and murder, and theft and adultery are rife. Crime follows upon crime, so that the earth is withered. Everything that dwells on it languishes. Beasts of the field and birds of the sky, even the fish of the sea perish. Let no man rebuke, let no man protest. For this your people has a grievance against you, O priest.
Okay, so notice first the general prophecy against the whole group, and notice a lot of the crimes are like the Ten Commandments, right? And now he's attacking the northern priesthood. Okay, go on.
You being facetious, in other words? You should rebuke, but he says,
Yeah, he's being sarcastic there.
okay. So you shall stumble by day, and by night a prophet shall stumble as well.
He's attacking the northern prophets who are not doing their jobs,
And
the
I will
court
destroy-
prophets.
And I will destroy your kindred. My people is destroyed because of your disobedience. Because you have rejected obedience, I reject you as my priest. Because you have spurned the teaching of your God, I in turn will spurn your children. The more they increase, the more they sinned against me. I will change their dignity to dishonor. They feed on my people's sin offerings, and so they desire its iniquity. Therefore the people shall fare like the priests. I will punish it for its conduct. I will requite it for its deeds. Truly they shall eat, but not be sated. They shall swill, but not be satisfied, because they have forsaken the Lord to practice lechery. Wine and new wine destroy destroy the mind of my people. It consults, it sticks. Its rod directs it.
That's the reference to a penis. In other words, immorality. Go on.
A lecherous impulse has made them go wrong, and they have strayed from submission to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and offer on the hills, under oaks, poplars, and terebinths, whose shade is so pleasant. Offer? Does that mean have bad relations?
Yeah.
That is why their daughters fornicate, and their daughters-in-law commit adultery.
Okay, so again, notice he's connecting the sacrifice on all of the local shrines together with immorality, both sexual and moral, ethical, other acts, and with lack of obedience to Yod He Vav He. Okay, and he goes on in that regard, and he talks about don't go to Gilgal. If you look a little further down, don't make pilgrimage to Beth Aven, which is a substitute for Bethel. Beth Aven means house of delusion, as opposed to Bethel, house of God. Okay? And take a look, verse 16. Sam, read from 16 now.
Israel has balked like a stubborn cow. Therefore the Lord will graze him on the range like a sheep. Ephraim is addicted to images. Let him be. They drink to excess. Their liquor turns against them. They love beyond measure. Disgrace is the gift which the wind is bringing. They shall garner shame from their sacrifice.
Okay, so again, this heavy critique on the north. Again, we can't precisely date when, but we know generally speaking. Now let's look at
What does love beyond measure mean? As in fornicate?
Yeah. Let's look at chapter 8 now, 1285. Robert, you want to begin reading?
Put a ram's horn to your mouth like an eagle over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and been faithless to my teaching. Israel cries out to me, "Oh my God, we are devoted to you."
Okay, now notice he uses my teaching, Torati. The use of the word teaching is a key word in Deuteronomy. So he's referring to, that term is not, we're in chapter 8, verse 1. That term in this context is the beginning to be used like it is in Deuteronomy. Okay, because the word Torah can mean all kinds of things. It can mean, Torat Kohanim, the teachings, of the priest, means the traditions of the priest. But here he's beginning to refer to God's teachings. Okay? Again, you have to remember, before this, you mostly have oral stuff. Read on. Israel rejects.
Israel rejects what is good. An enemy shall pursue him. They have made kings, but not with my sanctuary.
Notice, kings arise in Israel that are not appointed by God, unlike the south, right? Go on.
They have made officers, but not of my choice. Of their silver and gold they have made themselves images, to their own undoing. He rejects your calf, Samaria.
Samaria.
I am furious with them. Will they never be capable of purity? For it was Israel's doing. It was only made by a joiner. It is not a god. No, the calf of Samaria shall be reduced to splinters.
This is referring to those golden calves that Jeroboam the first erected it down in Bethel. Samaria here is the capital of the north, but is being referred to as the whole of the north, like Ephraim or Israel. And so he's saying these are idols. They are, when we know they probably weren't. They were, shrines to God. But the fact is, and the whole golden calf story, by the way, is, this lies behind the whole golden calf story. I mean, that's where it comes out of, essentially.
Meaning what?
The golden calves in northern Israel. All right? The shrines at Dan and Bethel.
The beginning of
Well,
the
it's-
diatribe against.
But the story in Exodus really telegraphs exactly what you're saying, because when they
Yeah.
declare Chag Ladonai Machar,
Yeah,
so that they're saying this worship in the north, if that's the worship in the north, it's worship of God.
yeah, exactly.
And
That's
the
what.
story is
yeah,
saying, no, it ain't.
Yeah, exactly. So then take a look. Keep reading. You see a famous
So
phrase
you're
here.
saying that the Deuteronomic school wrote the golden calf story?
No, I'm saying that whoever, I don't remember what documents lie behind it, but the golden calf story is really about the shrines at Dan and Bethel. That's what it's really about.
It's a projection.
Yeah,
projecting it
exactly.
back.
But again, because when they make the golden calf, they're not worshiping another god. They're worshiping God, but in the form of a golden calf. This is you. Yeah, seriously.
Some of us disagree with that.
No, but
statement.
that's probably what it's meant to be. It's improper worship.
That's the excuse for the apostasy committed at Sinai.
Well, an argument. Anyway, read on, because here you see a famous phrase.
They sow wind, and they shall reap whirlwind.
Okay, so that's where it comes from, by the way. Okay?
Standing stalks devoid of ears and yielding no flower, if they do yield, any strangers will devour it. Israel is bewildered. They have now become among the nations like an unwanted vessel, like a lonely wild ass, for they have gone up to Assyria. Ephraim has courted friendship, and while they are courting amongst the nations, there I will hold them fast, and they shall begin to diminish in number from the burden of kings and officers.
Now here, again, Hosea is not big on quoting real political events, but notice the north has begun to Assyria has arisen, not yet later in his life. They are becoming, they're courting Assyria. And by the way, when you do that, Assyria begins to have an impact on your culture and religious life. Okay? So he's condemning them. All right, read on for Ephraim. Here's where you get it.
For Ephraim has multiplied altars for guilt. His altars have redounded to his guilt. The many teachings I wrote for him have been treated as something alien.
There you go, right? Multiple altars, teachings. Okay? Again,
What verse is
Torah.
that?
Okay? Read on.
When they present sacrifices to me, it is but flesh for them to eat. The Lord has not accepted them. Behold, he remembers their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Back to Egypt with them. Israel has ignored his maker and built temples, and Judah has fortified many cities. So I will set fire to the cities, and it shall consume their fortresses.
Okay, so there you go. There,
Prophets.
right, exactly. And so there you have it. There you have it. There's the whole thing. If you want to see a couple of other, we'll look at very briefly. Look at chapter 10. Hang on, did I get this right?
We don't have any idea who's really listening to this or how.
What?
We have no idea who he's speaking.
No,
to
we
who's
don't, but his
listening to
stuff was
this.
preserved. Take a look, if you look in chapter 10, verse 12. No, forget that part. Okay. Let's see. No, I think it's. I made a mistake on that. All right. Take a look at chapter 12, verse 12, actually. Again, it talks about Gilgal being worthless. All right? And if you look at that, that's on chapter 12, verse 12. But then if you look at chapter 13, this is the last one we'll look at 1295. Take a look. Again, this is a critique of the images that are used, and also the fact that he's claiming that they're not only worshiping, but they're also worshiping Baal. In other words, they're not just improper worship of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, they've gone over the line. Look, okay? They've made molten images. And in fact, that's part of, and then take a look what he says. Only I, the Lord, have been your God ever since the land of Egypt. You have never known a true God but me. You've never had a helper other than me. This is, this is it. They forgot me. They're worshiping other gods. Okay? So,
But is this a secondary theme to the main theme, which is the multiple?
no, it's
sanctuaries and-
both of them.
and
In
the
other words,
images?
they see it as all part of the same thing. So Hosea is part of this, whether he's a single, or whether he is part of a movement in the north, but he's a continuation, as I said, that goes right back to Elijah and Elisha. This idea that there is, first of all, that there is actual worship of other gods, the Phoenician and Canaanite gods, but also that the multiple shrines are part of the problem. I mean, that's part of what emerges in the north, that the multiple shrines in themselves cause this problem. Okay? All right, so now we are going.
And any kind of images at all.
Yeah,
well,
yeah, of course, absolutely. Here, pass this. Here, this and a couple of Tanakhs. Okay, so now we're going to go to the reign of Hezekiah. And for this, we're going to 2 Kings.
Amos and Hosea lived under a different ruler.
No, well, Amos we know lived under Jeroboam II. Hosea lived under Jeroboam II and the ones who followed him. We don't know if he actually saw the destruction of the north or not. Again, it's very hard to date a lot of his stuff. So take a look at, we're going to start, there's a lot of material devoted to Hezekiah in Second Book of Kings because he's so important. We're not going to deal with all of it. If you take a look, first of all, we did chapter. Okay, so chapter 16 is basically the destruction. No, I wanted to point out one other thing. Go to chapter 16 of 2 Kings on page 814. Okay. It talks about one of the last kings of Israel, a guy named Pekah, and it talks about then if you go down and then that's King how Pekah and Rezin of Amram ally to attack Judea. Okay, so then what happens is that the Judean king, Ahaz,
What verse are you on?
verse 7, sends to the Assyrian emperor Tiglath-Pileser and says, I am your vassal king, come rescue me. And he bribes him with, this is on verse 8, with the gold and silver that were in the house of the Lord. In other words, he strips the temple and in his treasury and he sends them. And what happens is Tiglath-Pileser comes and attacks Damascus, the capital of Aram. Then notice what it says in verse 10. This is really important to understand what's going to be happening, what's happening in the south in all of this, because this is towards the very last years of the northern kingdom. Ahaz goes to Damascus, he meets with Tiglath-Pileser, and he makes a sketch of an altar he saw there and sends it to his high priest Uriah. They built the altar, okay, according to the design they saw, and Ahaz begins sacrificing on it. And he took the old altar and he moved it away and he put this new altar in. All right? And
This is in the temple in Jerusalem.
yeah, this is in the temple in Jerusalem. And then if you turn over the page, he removes some of the other furniture from the temple. And he says on verse 18, on account of the king of Assyria. So in other words, Ahaz is introducing innovations in the worship in the temple in Jerusalem based on influence from Assyria. And that's one of the things that happens in the south, is that because the south becomes dominated by Assyria and becomes a vassal kingdom of Assyria when the north is destroyed, there is influence of Assyrian religious practice on what's going on in Jerusalem, and then there's a reaction against it. Okay, that's the thing you have to understand. Part of what happens in the South when these reforms really take hold is not only what happened in the North, and therefore the Northerners are coming down and saying, you guys better, get into shape, look what happened to us, but also there are some serious issues in the South about assimilating to Assyrian religion.
I'm sorry for clarity, Rabbi. This is after the northern kingdom has fallen?
This is during the last years of the Northern Kingdom, the very last years. This incident occurs before the Northern Kingdom falls. Okay? This is during the time of Ahaz, not yet Hezekiah. It's under Hezekiah that it falls. Okay, so go to chapter, hang on. Okay, 13 to 16. All right. Okay, so now go to chapter 18 on page 820. This is when Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, becomes king. And he is critical in everything we're discussing, or at least his reign. Because it's during his reign that the north falls. It's during his reign that all these refugees come south. He extends the wall of Jerusalem to accommodate the increasing populations. He builds the water tunnel. He fortifies a lot of the cities in Judea. In other words, he's strengthening, even while he is a vassal king initially under the Assyrians because of his father, he is making moves to try and become independent. And we have to look at his reform in light of those circumstances, right? The political circumstances are he doesn't want to be under the Assyrians. All right, so let's begin chapter 18, verse 1. Cal, do you want to start reading?
In the third year of King Hoshea, the son of Elah of Israel, Hezekiah, son of King Ahaz of Judah, became king. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years.
A long time.
His mother's name was Abi, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was pleasing to the Lord, just as his father David had done. He abolished the shrines, smashed the pillars, and cut down the sacred post. He also broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until that time the Israelites had been offering sacrifices to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted only in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those before him. He clung to the Lord. He did not turn away from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord had given to Moses. And the Lord was always with him. He was successful wherever he turned. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He overran Philistia as far as Gaza and its border areas, from watchtower to fortified town.
Okay, and remember, this is the later Deuteronomic people giving their editorial comments on Hezekiah. And
Favorable.
yes, and of course, and by the way, they smooth over the fact that Judea was almost destroyed under the Assyrians came and attacked, and in fact, he didn't defeat the Assyrians. He barely survived. But that was later on. The point is, look at what it says he did. Okay? And if you take a look at the material I gave you today, or if you copied it off, look at number 2, Actions of Hezekiah and the book of Deuteronomy. Right? If you go through every one of these actions that he did, it is directly, you can find texts in Deuteronomy that are directly related to that. Okay? Abolish the local shrines. Chapter 12 of Deuteronomy is very much about centralization of worship. Smash the sacred, that's the same text. Broke the bronze snake of Moses. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's
The famous incident, people are sin, they start getting bitten by snakes, and so what does that smack of? Magic. So there's a strong attack on magical practices in Deuteronomy, not as strong as Leviticus.
That's a pretty strong thing to do, you know?
Yeah, isn't it?
I mean, to break Moses' serpent?
Yeah, well, because it had become an idol, it says. In other words, what used to be a curative thing, an amulet, we might say, a fetish, has become an idol. And then notice the phrase, clung to the Lord, or the English term, cleave, the verb davak. Okay? There is a specific commandment in Deuteronomy to cleave to the Lord. This is very much the language of Deuteronomy. So even though it's written later or edited later, and he is being cast as the Deuteronomics, poster boy, the fact is that they saw his reign as a high point, as a reform that went on. And again, he kept the commandments very much like many things in Deuteronomy. You must keep the commandments of the Lord your God, okay? So Hezekiah is a hero of the later school, but this does in fact reflect what he was doing. He initiated a major reform based upon everything that we have been doing so far with Amos and Hosea and the northern critique, the problem of the north. Because right after this, in verse 9, it talks about the fall of the north, and then it talks about Sennacherib attacking Judea. The point is, he ends up, by the way, submitting to the Assyrians as a vassal king, and of course the Assyrians do serious damage to the Judean state. They destroy Lachish, one of the most important towns. They destroy a number of local towns. Some people think that Judea was essentially reduced to a city-state. In other words, they come up against Jerusalem, but the Assyrians leave. And the story, and of course in Kings, is that God struck them down, but we don't know why the Assyrians didn't destroy Jerusalem. It may be he paid them off. It may be that there was a revolt somewhere. But the fact is that Hezekiah barely survives. All right, now the rest, we're going to skip some chapters here.
Can I ask that question though about the deed stuff here? So,
Yeah.
Hezekiah was of the Davidic dynasty?
Yes, because the South is always Davidic.
So, in the book of Deuteronomy assumed to be brought forth by Josiah.
Yeah,
which
that's
is,
one.
what,
Yeah,
100 years later, roughly.
yeah, 100
Something
years
like
later.
that. Found, right? The book is
Yeah,
found,
right.
But maybe it's not in quotes, because if they're saying if Hezekiah had this agenda already,
Yep.
it could be that he developed it. This was his text, and if you see so many similarities between the two, but then it gets pushed aside by people who afterwards, and it gets brought back.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when you get these kinds of revolutions and reactions, we saw this it's all over the history. of
Yeah,
England,
absolutely.
Is that you have things emerge that get suppressed again, and then
Yep.
they reemerge later with other, or what you could, I don't know if you were reading this potentially as just the way that today, if you typical in any kind of, and it's always I think probably been the case, that later politicians will look to the hero of the earlier age and say,
Yeah.
they did this and this and this
Right,
and this,
right.
really just their own agenda.
Yeah, no,
and
it's
not what they actually did.
look, the fact is we know archaeologically he shut down the local shrines. Or he did, or rather, he didn't shut them down completely, But what he did was, for example, at Arad, he got rid of the steles. And some people think that what he did was he shut down animal sacrifice in the local shrines, restricted animal sacrifice only to Jerusalem, and only allowed meal offerings and incense offerings in the local shrines. It was Josiah who destroyed them. But the fact is, there was a centralization tendency during Hezekiah. There's no doubt about it. Whether the original version of Deuteronomy was written during his time is a distinct possibility. Something is coalescing. The Deuteronomic ideology is coalescing from the time of Hezekiah and reaches its peak late 100 years later. Because you're right, now we're gonna look at the reaction back against it by his son. Yeah, Robert.
Are you going to be discussing the possible role of Ezra in this?
No, because Ezra is hundreds of years later. He has absolutely no role in this at all. Okay? You got to stop bringing in Ezra. He's hundreds of years later, after all of this has become the norm. Okay? All right, look, take a look at chapter 21. Hezekiah dies, and his son Manasseh takes over. Take a look at what they have to say about Manasseh.
What page are we?
We're on page 829. Cal, you want to keep reading?
Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem.
Okay, Manasseh's around for a very long time, okay?
His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did what was displeasing to the Lord,
Page 829.
following the abhorrent practices of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites. He rebuilt the shrines that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal and made a sacred post, as King Ahab of Israel had done. He bowed down to all the host of heaven and worshipped them. And he built altars for them in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, I will establish my name in Jerusalem.
That's a Deuteronomic saying, by the way. Go on. He built?
He built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of the Lord. He consigned his son to the fire. He practiced soothsaying and divination, and consulted ghosts and familiar spirits. He did much that was displeasing to the Lord to vex him. The sculptured image of Asherah that he made, he placed in the house concerning which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem.
All right, we can skip that part. Go down to verse 9. In other words, it's quoting from the earlier stuff of what God promised to David. Go on, go to verse 9. But they did not obey.
They did not obey. And Manasseh led them astray to do greater evil than the nations that the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. Therefore, the Lord spoke through his servants, the prophets.
Okay, and then what you see is this general prophecy that is about the destruction of Jerusalem and Judea, okay, because they've gone the way of the north. All right? I will wipe Jerusalem, it's on the next page, as clean as a wipes a dish, and I will cast off the remnant of my people and deliver them into the hands of their enemies. In other words, during the time of Manasseh, because of all his evil deeds, the prophets are arising to say the south will be destroyed like the north. Okay? And take a look in verse 16. He's accused of bloodshed. All right? And then after he dies, Ammon becomes king. And then after Ammon, here's where we go to the next century. We're now in the 7th century BCE. And now, by the way, we didn't look at Isaiah. Isaiah is during the time of Hezekiah. And if you look at Isaiah is probably a court prophet because he has close ties with Hezekiah. And so all the prophecies of Isaiah is definitely, he's a south prophet, but he's definitely in the same spirit as the north. In other words, he is one of the, fans of centralization, support of the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, he's very much a believer in the royal Davidic cult, but also he is a social critic. But he also feels that he produces a vision of the future in which even if things go bad, everything will come back. In other words, that there's the possibility of return, repentance, renewal. Isaiah is very important on that part. Okay? In other words, especially what we would call a kind of messianic future. So Isaiah is part of this whole thing as well. He's during the time of Hezekiah, and he is an important influence.
What was the messianic piece of Isaiah?
Well, you know that eventually there will be the best possible Davidic ruler. There will be peace in the land. Israel will be Judea will be reunited together.
People abandoned.
Well, there
these
will
other
be
things.
some destruction, but then there will be a return, and then it'll even be a return to like the Garden of Eden. This is chapter 11, right?
So let me ask you something.
Yeah.
There are Psalms that describe exactly that, like the destruction and then the rebuilding.
Yeah.
Is that like
That's later.
everything later in the
No,
book
no.
of Psalms?
The Psalms are hard to date.
So it may
No,
be influenced
well,
by
there's
this
obviously
back and
there.
forth?
Yeah, well, they're look when the Psalms are edited, they are edited and rewritten in some cases through the lens of this ideology. Okay, you have to understand some of the Psalms were altered from their original compositions
How would
to
you know
fit
that?
the later stricter monotheism. Okay,
How would they know that?
just analysis of the Psalms, they're able to tell that. Some of the Psalms reflect the earlier stuff, and again, it's very hard to date the Psalms. A bunch of them are written in the Second Temple period, but the earliest Psalms probably come from all around, but from local shrines. But they are, in many cases, shaped to
So what's
fit
an
the new
early
ideology.
material in that respect?
Psalm 29.
Okay.
Okay.
And this Isaiah stuff, I mean, it sounds like you're saying, or just putting the two and two together, is that whole theme of destruction and renewal is tied to Hezekiah and what happened when he was attacked and the place was almost wiped out.
Yeah, exactly.
But then it survived because he was devout, and now you've got, and there's like it's really the hope for that return of the messianic thing. So he would, and when it did succeed, because they survived, his text would have been.
But they survived as a vassal kingdom, and so what the Messianic era is, of course, is a return to the Davidic independence, power. The nations come to us. We will be like the head. We won't be under the thumb of an empire. Don't forget, I mean, part of the big spiritual problem is if God is God, why is God's people being under the thumb of foreign rulers? That's going to become especially evident when the temple is destroyed, right?
There doesn't seem to be any prophet at the time of Manasseh, which you'd think would be a really good.
Well, none that we have. Okay, none that we have. There may have been, but they may have.
He could have also killed them.
Yeah, exactly. So what happens is that Manasseh's grandson and Hezekiah's great-grandson is Josiah. And here we have Josiah is the key person and the key event. So go to chapter 22 on page 831. And several chapters are devoted to Josiah. We're not going to look at all of it, but let's begin with page 831. Jordan, you want to start reading? Josiah was 8 years old?
Sure. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Yedidiah, daughter of Adiah of
Bozkah.
Botzkat. Right. He did what was pleasing to the Lord, and he followed all the ways of his ancestor David. He did not deviate to the right or to the left. That's like Deuteronomy.
Yeah, okay. So then what happens is that in verse 3, they begin to renovate the house. Okay? And then take a look, skip down to verse 8.
His scribe, right.
Okay, go ahead.
Then the high priest Hilkiah said to the scribe Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the teaching in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it. The scribe Shaphan then went to the king and reported to the king, Your servants have melted down the silver that was deposited in the house, and they have delivered it to the overseers of the work who are in charge of the house of the Lord. The scribe Shaphan also told the king, The high priest Hilkiah has given me a scroll. And Shaphan read it to the king. When the king heard the words of the scroll of the teaching, he rent his clothes. And the king gave orders to the priest Hilkiah and to Ahikam, son of Shaphan, Achbor, son of Michaiah, the scribe Shaphan, and Asaiah, the king's minister. Go inquire of the Lord on my behalf, and on behalf of the people, and on behalf of all Judah, concerning the words of this scroll that has been found. For great indeed must be the wrath of the Lord that has been kindled against us, because our fathers did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed for us.
Okay, they find this scroll. This, everybody agrees, is some form of the book of Deuteronomy, an early edition, which has been hidden there, obviously by the reformers, because the rule of Manasseh is long and hard, and they are being suppressed, obviously. So they hide this. How much this group survives as a physical group or not, who knows? Maybe they're underground, but they hid this. And again, it is the Sefer Torah. This is the first time this is used in that regard. The book of teaching.
Hidden there or placed there to be found?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Preserving it, hidden it to be found.
No, as a subterfuge.
Like pious forgery.
No, not a pious forgery, as
It's put there so that it will become
hoping it will be found. Absolutely. To preserve this great teaching, of the Lord that must be preserved, because look what Manasseh did, right? And what is it? The scribe reads it to the king and he freaks out. He says, oh my God, God must be incredible. Because don't forget, what's still in the temple? All that stuff that Manasseh, his grandfather, erected, all these extra figures, God knows what else, are in the temple. And, he's doing a renovation. And he's saying, oh my God, look at what it says and look at what we're doing. So what does he do? He says, go find a prophet and find out what's going to happen. So they go find a prophet, only it's a female prophet named Huldah. And there's this long whole thing in which she gives him a prophecy that, Israel's going to be destroyed, but because of you, I'm going to delay it. In other words, what Manasseh did has set the fate of Judea, but because of pious Josiah, it will not happen during his lifetime. It'll happen afterwards.
How come we don't hear too much about Huldah?
Because most people haven't read this part of the Bible. Okay, so then look at chapter 23. Huldah is apparently a very prominent person.
But
Yes.
she's a female. So
Yeah, we know that there are female prophets.
It's funny. I never noticed that. In one sentence, you have Achbor, which is a mouse.
Yeah,
Shaphan,
which
which
is
is a rabbit.
a rabbit.
And Huldah, which is a rat.
Yes.
One sentence.
Well, they're playing around. I mean, they must be. I mean,
It's
how
like-
can you do that? I mean, without knowing.
I have no idea why they're calling this. Is this some kind of funny thing going on? Is this nicknames? We don't know. Okay?
So weird.
Yeah, it is kind of
Well,
weird.
It's like underground kind of feeling.
Okay.
All those.
All right. Good point. Good point. Yeah.
Is it unusual to have the genealogy of yeah?
No, well, it's unusual to have anybody's genealogy, but the fact that they give it shows how prominent she is. Okay?
Isn't she like? There's a book of what? There's a lot. There's a lot about
This
her
is
in the
it. No,
Talmud,
this is
there's
well, in the Talmud probably, but this is all we know of her, okay? Was there a book of Huldah? Who knows?
Where is Huldah talked about? Where are we?
We're on chapter 22, verse 14. She gives the prophecy. She is the one she's giving basically the same kind of stuff that Hosea is, that Jeremiah will give. I mean, she's right in the line with all of this stuff. She's part of this group. Maybe she's one of the remnant of the group that managed to survive through the reign of Manasseh, just waiting for the scroll to be discovered. Who knows? Okay, but she's definitely part of the reform group.
Could the Chazan give us the translation of the proper nouns in verse 14?
with pleasure. And Hilkiah the priest, and Achikam, and Achbor, which is a mouse,
And Shaphan, which is a rabbit.
Va'asaya, there's no. I don't know.
Yeah, went to the prophetess, which is in
Huldah.
Nivia, Huldah. Yeah, that's it. I mean, the translation is accurate. All right, let's look at chapter 23. Jordan,
She's sitting in the Mishneh. What's a Mishneh? She was sitting like in.
it's a quarter in Jerusalem. In other words, when Hezekiah extends the wall, he creates a whole new neighborhood that's called the Mishneh.
Oh, that's like
Okay.
it's the second. It's the second neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. The second neighborhood. That's what that is.
Wow.
All right. So, Jordan, start chapter 23 at the king's summons.
At the king's summons, all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem assembled before him. The king went up to the house of the Lord, together with all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets, all the people, young and old. And he read to them the entire text of the covenant scroll, which had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and solemnized the covenant before the Lord, that they would follow the Lord and observe his commandments, his injunctions, and his laws with all their heart and soul, that they would fulfill the terms of this covenant as inscribed upon the scroll. And all the people entered into the covenant.
What does this sound like?
Sinai.
Sinai.
It's Deuteronomy. I mean,
Sinai, right? Sinai. And when they entered the land of Israel, Joshua convened something like this.
Right.
There's
Sounds
another.
like the end of Deuteronomy.
Yeah,
It sounds
right.
like we should-
Deuteronomy
that-
says you're supposed to do this every certain amount of time. You're supposed to convene everybody at the time of Sukkot and renew the covenant. We know that Ezra does it, right? This is where Ezra gets it from. This is something that's already established and is in the book of Deuteronomy. That's why Ezra does it. This is the way you renew, like you're standing again at Mount Sinai, these covenant renewal ceremonies. We don't know how often they were done, but it's evident that they were done occasionally, maybe more regularly than we know, right? What happened to them? Well, that's what the Shema is, by the way. The Shema becomes the replacement for these mass covenant renewal ceremonies. Okay.
Yeah, this sounds so much like Nitzavim, though, because
Yeah,
all
it
the
is.
people are gathered
Absolutely.
and they name,
And the
you know,
language here is the
Yom
same as
Tov,
Deuteronomy. Exactly.
You know.
All right, so he has some kind of covenant renewal ceremony. Okay, and then look at verse 4. Now he's acting. Go ahead.
Then the king ordered the high priest Hilkiah, the priests of the second rank, and the guards of the threshold to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the objects made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he removed the ashes to Beit El. He suppressed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to make offerings at the shrines in the towns of Judah and in the environs of Jerusalem, and those who made offerings to Baal, to the sun, moon, and constellations, all the hosts of heaven.
In other words, we're not talking about priests who are worshiping God at the local shrines. They're worshiping foreign gods.
Right.
Go on.
He brought out the image of Asherah from the house of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it in the Kidron Valley. He beat it to dust and scattered its dust over the burial ground of the common people.
Just like Moses did with the golden calf. There is a hint here of Josiah as a new Moses. Okay? Go on.
Where Moses is an old Josiah.
Yeah, right.
He tore down the cubicles of the male prostitutes in the house of the Lord at the place where the women wove coverings for Asherah.
Okay, in other words, certain of we're not exactly sure what these are. There may have been in some of the fertility cults in the ancient Near East, there were temple prostitutes that were involved with certain sexual, in other words, like sexual offerings, so to speak. Go on. He brought
all the priests from the towns of Judah to Jerusalem and defiled the shrines where the priests had been making offerings from, Geva?
Yeah.
Geva to Beersheba.
In other words, these are not the idolatrous priests. These are the local priests.
Right.
He shuts, and by the way, this is archaeological. We know that Josiah destroyed the temple at Arad. Okay? So now it's not, he's going much further than his great-grandfather. And he's bringing all these priests who are now out of a job into Jerusalem. Go on.
He also demolished the shrines at the gates, which are at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the city prefect, which were on a person's left upon entering the city gate.
In other words, there were little shrines even in Jerusalem.
The priests of the shrines, however, did not ascend the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread along with their kinsmen.
Okay, in other words, the ones who officiated at all the local shrines were prohibited from doing the sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem because and what happens is that nonetheless, he continues to support them with certain kinds of priestly like pensions, so that at least they can eat. This may be when you get the Aaronites become the only priests, and the rest of the local priests who are from the tribe of Levi now are relegated to the Levites with the secondary status in the temple, which is what happens as part of the regular practice in the Second Temple period. In other words, it gets formalized in the Torah that only the descendants of Aaron can become Kohanim, and all the other priests, whatever their backgrounds, whether they're Levites or something else, they're no longer able to do this. And what emerges then is this secondary class of sacral workers who in the Second Temple period are called the Levites. But in the First Temple period, they were priests.
Are the Maccabees part of that group?
No, Maccabees are by that period, which is hundreds of years later. Yeah, they are regular Kohanim, but they're not of the high priest. There's a difference. There becomes a difference, okay? All right, so then if you take a look, he defiles Tophet, which was a place in the valley of Gehinnom, where people used to do apparently child sacrifices, okay? Now, notice, he did away with the horses that the king of Judah dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord. This is Assyrian stuff. Scholars believe this is all Assyrian kind of practices, all right? Burn down the chariots of the sun. This is sun worship. This probably is an influence from Assyria. And then it says, he tears down the altar made by the kings of Judah on the roof of the upper. In other words, he is going through everything bit by bit. He destroys the temples that Solomon built for his foreign wives. Okay? And notice on top of the next page, verse 15, he destroys Bethel. And again, grinds it to dust, reflecting of the golden calf. And then he takes the graves, and to make sure that nobody's ever going to worship there again, he renders them impure by putting bones on the old altars and sites. Okay? So, and then verse 9, it just goes over and over and over again, but then look at verse 21. Now comes something equally as important. Now, so he's cleansed the entire kingdom. And by the way, Josiah's kingdom probably extended a large part into the north. He had recaptured some of the old territory. So we're not talking about a small Judea. We're talking about expanded Judea, probably incorporating the territories of Benjamin and a little bit more of the north, because he's going up to Bethel, right? So he controls the area around Bethel. This is because the Syrians...
Bethel is in Benjamin or in the...
I think it's in Ephraim, actually. Why is he able to do this? Because the Assyrians are now under heavy attack by the Babylonians, and the Assyrian Empire is being destroyed. So there's a power vacuum in this area, and he's able... some people feel that one of the reasons why he's able to do all this reform is because he's thrown off the Assyrian control, so he can destroy all this Assyrian influence. They can't do anything to him, right? So, we tend to divide the political and the religious, but it's all of one piece. Political independence also for him means religious purification. All right? And this is the Deuteronomic revolution. Okay, so Ellie, you want to pick it up on verse 21 on page 835. The king commanded...
He commanded all the people, offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God as prescribed in this scroll of the covenant. Now the Passover sacrifice had not been offered in that manner in the days of the chieftains who ruled Israel, or during the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah.
This is an astounding claim that nobody had celebrated Pesach since the days of the judges. We don't know whether it's true or not, but in other words, one of the most important things, in Jewish practice in the Second Temple period, and becomes one of the central ritual in Rabbinic Judaism, apparently had been in abeyance for hundreds of years. This is astounding. Again, we don't know if it's true, but he renews the Pesach. Go read on. Only in the 18th.
Only in the 18th year of King Josiah was such a Passover sacrifice offered in that manner to the Lord.
So we know that Pesach is an important holiday in the book of Deuteronomy. It's a very critical part of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is the one that very, very clearly takes away the idea of Pesach and the other festivals as harvest festivals and really makes them part of the Exodus story. That's the historicizing myth. Then it talks about how he does away with all the necromancers, the mediums, and all the magical practices. And then it says, thus he fulfilled the terms of the teaching recorded in the scroll that the priest Hilkiah found in the house of the Lord. There was no king like him who turned back to the Lord with all his heart and all. This is all Deuteronomic language, right? B'chol levavcha, v'chol nafshecha, right? Okay? Nor did any like him arise after him. But God was just, the account of Menashe's sins are still going to have to be accounted for. Okay, so unfortunately, what happens to Josiah is that Josiah allies himself with the Babylonians. The Egyptians are trying to stop the Babylonians by allying themselves with the remnants of the Assyrians. The Assyrians create a kind of rump kingdom. They've lost their main cities, but to the west, in what we would call today northwestern Syria, they have created a kind of a last holdout. And the Egyptians are going to come up to help them. But Josiah evidently must have been allied with the Babylonians because he goes down with his army to stop the Egyptians from joining the Assyrians. What happens is that there is a battle at Megiddo, because Megiddo is a strategic site where the coastal road moves inland through a pass. That's how you get from the coast inland to Damascus. And he's killed. And he's brought home. What happens then is Josiah is killed.
Who
And
wins the battle?
Pharaoh Necho, the Egyptians. All right? Now what happens is that his son becomes king, but Necho deposes him, and he takes a different one of Josiah's other sons and puts him as a vassal king to the Egyptians. So briefly, Judea then becomes a vassal state of Egypt, and his name is Elakim, but he changes his name, his throne name, evidently, is now Jehoiakim. All right? He takes the guy's brother and he takes him to Egypt. And anyway, so now the Israelites are under the Egyptians. Okay? But the Babylonians come along and they force the Judeans now to become one of their vassal states. They get rid of the Egyptians. Okay, so let's take a look. And what eventually happens is that this Jehoiakim becomes a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar, and after he dies, his son Jehoiakim ventures him, and Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon with probably a bunch of the other small states in the area. Nebuchadnezzar comes, he attacks Jerusalem, he deposes the king, he puts his brother Zedekiah in his place. This is the first wave of the exile. Jehoiachin and a whole bunch of the upper crust of Jerusalem are carried off by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, and that's the beginning of the Babylonian exile. But
Josiah was an ally of Babylon.
Yeah.
Then Egypt puts another guy on the throne who's still part of
one of his sons,
who is an ally of Egypt, then comes down and attacks them, and
then Babylon comes and they've become an ally of Babylon. Then there's a revolt against Babylon. Babylonians come and they reduce Judea to much less powerful than before, and they take the king who's on the throne and they put his brother up instead. And they take the king, the royal family, and a whole bunch of other people to Babylon, but they haven't destroyed Jerusalem, okay? That's the first wave. What happens is Zedekiah is an idiot, and he ends up rebelling against Babylon, and this time they come and they destroy Jerusalem, they kill him, they carry off practically everybody else. That's the second wave. But then there's a third wave a little later on, when the governor that the Babylonians appointed is murdered, and a bunch of others. So there's three waves of exile. One before the destruction of Jerusalem, one as part of the destruction of Jerusalem, and one after. Okay? that's all around the early part of the 6th century BCE. Now, the prophet Jeremiah is the guy who lives through all of this. We probably know more about him than any of the other prophets. He begins to prophesy. He is born during the time of King
What are you
Josiah.
talking about now?
Jeremiah. He's born during the time of Josiah. We don't know what he was doing before this, but at the time that Josiah, let's take a look. Go to the book of Jeremiah. Go to the beginning of Jeremiah. Again, we have a title here.
I just wanted to say one thing, that
Yeah.
the Egyptians changed the name from Eliakim
Yeah.
to Jehoiakim.
No, he did. He changed his name. In other words, he wasn't supposed to be king. He's the second son. And we know that the Judean kings probably took throne names. That most of the names that are recorded are their throne names that they assumed when they became king. So this guy's real name was Eliakim, but when he became king, he took a throne name.
No, but from El to Yud Hey Vav Hey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he takes a throne
But that's
name.
not the Egyptian.
No, they didn't
Oh,
do
okay.
that. That was the practice they did.
Okay.
Okay, take a look at the beginning of Jeremiah. Okay, we learn a lot about him. This is on page 1003. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anatot in the territory of Benjamin. This is very important. First of all, Jeremiah is a Kohen. He is a descendant of Aaron through Eli in the days of Samuel. His ancestor, Abiathar, was exiled by Solomon to Anatot. Why? Because Abiathar had supported Solomon's brother when King David died. So the line of Abiathar, which was the original line of the high priests, was exiled to Anatot. Okay? Solomon put Zadok in his place. Zadok was a cousin to Abiathar. They were both descended from Eli. The high priesthood then comes down through Zadok, all the way through to the Maccabean period. Okay? Now, therefore, Jeremiah himself is a priest of good lineage. Secondly, Anatot is on the border to the north, which means when the northern refugees came south, a lot of them probably ended up there, or at least some of them did. So here's where Jeremiah begins from probably absorbed the northern ideology. Because we know he knows the works of Amos. We know he knows the works of Micah. We know he knows the works of Hosea. Right? There's influence from all of that. There's other influences on Jeremiah as well. There's influences from the Temple Psalms. But he is part of the reforming group. Now, 1 second, Cantor. Look what it says. The word of the Lord came to him in the days of Josiah, son of Amnon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. That's when Josiah started the Reformation. So, Jeremiah begins to prophesy in the exact time when Deuteronomy is found and the Deuteronomic revolution begins. So he is part of that reforming movement. No doubt about it. There's a lot of linguistic connections between Jeremiah's rhetoric and Deuteronomy, but he didn't write the book.
I merely quote Friedman.
I know. I don't think he wrote the book.
Why would you say no, and why would Friedman say yes?
Friedman thinks that Jeremiah was there, and Jeremiah was essentially the author.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think he's part of the whole group. And don't forget, what they discover in the temple is not the book of Deuteronomy as we have it. Okay? It's an earlier edition. Okay? And notice, so he starts in the time of Josiah and throughout the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, when Jerusalem went to exile. So he lives through the whole thing. Right? He lives through the death of Josiah. He has a lament for Josiah. He lives through the invasions. He survives the siege of Jerusalem barely with his life. And after the battle, he is part of a group of refugees that end up in Egypt. He never goes to Babylon. But he's
That's
in
the third wave that ends up in Egypt.
no, some of them go to Babylon, some of them, yeah, but there, a bunch of Judean refugees end up in Egypt, and he's one of them. He didn't want to go, but he was forced by his friends, basically. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
The ideology of the South versus the North.
Yeah.
The South has the lineage of King David.
Yeah,
and all that.
exactly.
What the North? What do they bring except the social?
They bring the whole Deuteronomic, shut down the local shrines, only one shrine. You know,
Even
a
because-
stricter form of monotheism. All the
Because they are coming-
characteristics.
because they themselves are coming south.
Yeah, because they saw what happened in the south, in the north. They had all this history from the time of Elijah and Elisha, and then they've got the influence of Amos and Hosea and all those people, the proto-Deuteronomic people, whoever they were. That group of reformers comes south and says, "See what happened? See what happened?"
So the Deuteronomic revolution starts in the north.
Well, that's what I've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. Okay? The origins of it are in the north. The whole change from the old Israelite religion to the new form of Israelite religions begins in the north, and is the Deuteronomic revolution is the key to that.
And they bring it to the south after the north is destroyed.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's all an hypothesis, obviously.
Well, gravity is just a theory too, but you don't walk off a cliff. In other words, there's a lot of there's a lot of good
I don't
evidence.
agree with that.
No, but the point is, there's a lot of evidence for this. I
On
mean,
the day when the climate change report is came out,
Yeah,
it said
exactly.
The temperatures are rising.
Yeah,
still
look,
half the people in the country don't
so
believe
it's when I hear somebody say it's just a theory, that's what I say. So
Right,
if it's
right.
just a theory, so is gravity. Are you going to go walk off a cliff to see whether it works or not? The point is that there is sufficient evidence from the texts about Hezekiah, from archaeology, from the prophets. All of this has been carefully reconstructed over the last 200 years worth of study of the Bible. Now, there's details that are argued about, but the essential framework, everybody agrees.
And the core people are Hosea and Amos from the north.
Yeah, well, because there's, and
Well, Amos went north
Micah
from the
also is
south,
important.
right?
Yeah,
Amos was a southerner. who
yeah,
went
well,
north.
exhort, right. But the point is that they're the ones that we have the books of. I mean, but again, it goes back.
Okay. So I'm sorry, but the prophets of the first temple, there is archaeological finding from that period
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
Yeah, well, the Temple of Arad is destroyed during time of
And
Josiah.
they saw these names anywhere or
No. Well, first of all, some of the names of some of the court officials in the time of Zedekiah, they found their seals that they
Okay.
did. They have found the seal of Jeremiah's secretary Baruch ben Neriah. In other words, they found all kinds of names of people. Have they found the name Amos anywhere? No, they haven't. But the point is, let's assume these guys existed because their books were preserved, their teachings were preserved, and Jeremiah, in effect, kind of quotes some of them. All right, we can see the influence. Okay, all right. So let's look at Jeremiah. Let's begin his very first prophecy. Who'd like to read with verse 4?
The word of the Lord came to me. Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet concerning the nations. I replied, Ah, Lord God, I don't know how to speak, for I am still a boy. And the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am still a boy, but go wherever I send you and speak whatever I command you. Have no fear of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. The Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Herewith I put my words in your mouth. See, I appoint you this day over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant.
All right, so that is his appointment. Okay, it's very typical for a prophet, the mouth. I mean, there's a lot of, you see this with Ezekiel, it's very similar to Moses. You know, this is a typical...
The reluctant prophet.
Yeah, the reluctant prophet. There's similarities to Isaiah, although Isaiah was volunteers. He's reluctant, you know. And by the way, he complains a lot. I mean, okay, go on. The word of the Lord. Now we're going to see now we see a prophecy.
The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah?
This is great.
I replied, I see a branch of an almond tree. The Lord said to me, You have seen right, for I am watchful to bring my word to pass.
That's a pun between the word for almond tree and the verb for watchful.
Yeah.
Go
What
on.
is the pun?
Shaked and
Well, it's the same. It's the same root.
And the word of the Lord came to me a second time. What do you see? I replied, I see a steaming pot tipping away from the north. And the Lord said to me, from the north shall disaster break loose upon all the inhabitants of the land, for I am summoning all the peoples of the kingdoms of the north, declares the Lord. They shall come and shall each set up a throne before the gates of Jerusalem, against its walls round about, and against all the towns of Judah. And I will argue my case against them. For all their wickedness they have forsaken me, and sacrificed to other gods, and worshipped the works of their hands. So you, gird up your loins, arise and speak to them all that I command you. Do not break down before them, lest I break you before them.
Okay.
I make you this day a fortified city, and an iron pillar, and bronze walls, against the whole land, against Judah's kings and officers, and against its priests and citizens. They will attack you, but they shall not overcome you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to save you.
Okay. So, and he really needs this because he is going to be thrown in jail. They're going to try to kill him. I mean, he really needs this. Okay. But take a look at chapter 2 now. This first prophecy is very much like Hosea. This is right out of Hosea practically. The idea of Israel as God's wife and how he used to follow me and everything like that. Okay? So this here you see the influence of Hosea at the beginning of it. So, and then you notice if you go down.
Can we assume Hosea is earlier, or maybe?
Oh, yeah, he is. Of course, he's way earlier.
Yeah.
Okay? He's during the time of, Hezekiah.
Well, there's a whole different woman here.
Well, but still, it's the same
Yeah,
imagery.
yeah.
Okay? All right? So the point is that, take a look on the next page. The prophecy continues where he talks about the Exodus from Egypt and how they really, didn't, how.
Where are you, Rabbi?
I'm on page 1006, verse 8. And notice it says, the guardians of the teaching ignored me. The people who should have taught the teachings of Deuteronomy, the teaching, have not done their job. The rulers rebelled against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal and followed what can do good. In other words, there are prophets here who are not prophesying my word. And in fact, Jeremiah there's a prophet in Jerusalem who is his antagonist. Everything he does, this guy says the opposite. Okay?
Where is that?
Well, later on in the story, because the book of Jeremiah has a lot of narrative parts as well as
With a
the
name?
poetic part.
Somebody with a name?
Yeah, somebody's name.
Could Tofsei HaTorah be taken very literally that he this is already Josiah's brought forth this book?
Yeah.
That was from the past, and it's like these people had this book.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
They were the people who held onto it ignored it.
They've got it and they've ignored it. Absolutely. It's all there. Now take a look at the beginning of chapter 3 on page 1009. Here is an example of an exact parallel to a law in Deuteronomy.
Where are we, chapter?
Chapter 3, beginning 1. He's using an analogy here. The word of the Lord came to me as follows. If a man divorces his wife and she leaves him and marries another man, can he ever go back to her? Would not such a land be defiled? Well, that's the law in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. In that law, when a man divorces his wife and she marries somebody else and then that other person divorces her, she's not allowed to remarry her first husband. And so Jeremiah is quoting the book of Deuteronomy here. The law code of Deuteronomy as an analogy to his prophecy. By the way, the law code of Deuteronomy precedes the Deuteronomic school, by the way. That's the thing you have to understand. The law, the heart of Deuteronomy, is a law code that dates back earlier than the Deuteronomic school takes this law code and incorporates it in.
But Hosea marries a whore.
Yes, he does, but Jeremiah, as far as you know, Jeremiah never marries anybody.
So put it in the map. So you have these laws that that
Here,
are
take a look.
there.
Take a look on the last page of what I gave you. I gave you here a chart of the documentary
Six
about this.
or five.
This is today's stuff. Page 3.
You know, happy.
I could not find a chart that I was 100% happy with. Okay? But you see here it says chart of the documentary hypothesis. So DTR1 is the original edition of Deuteronomy. Okay? That's what Jeremiah found. Sorry, that's what Josiah found. But if you were to draw a line above that, you could put law code. In other words, from an earlier period, the core of the law code is incorporated into DTR1. Then comes the next addition, which is DTR2, and that brings the final edition of Deuteronomy. And in addition, the Deuteronomy produces the Deuteronomic history. In other words, the shaping of all the materials of the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuels, and Kings. That's how we get all of that.
Now we have Rabbi Troster's variation on Friedman's analysis, because
Friedman's
what
not the
you
only,
you say-
Robert Friedman's not the only guy on all this.
Yeah, but I'm very ignorant, Rabbi.
No,
That's where
I'm saying is that this is the general accepted thing. I could not find a better chart than this. This is the overall accepted way
Where is this from?
in which it's on the internet all over the place. The point is that this is the generally accepted way in which the overall structure of how Deuteronomy emerges, and then you see it eventually gets put into what's called the Torah.
What does R stand for?
Redactor, the editors. There's a series of editing, and even there's a final little bit of post-Deuteronomic editing to Deuteronomy to fit it in with the rest of the Torah. There's a few things at the end of Deuteronomy that were stuck in from P, J, and E.
Could you just comment briefly what P, J, and E?
We'll get to that. The J and E is the earliest traditions. From the
Even
E is
earlier
from the
than
north.
Deuteronomy?
Yeah. I mean, these are the oral traditions, the stories, the Israelite religion, what we were talking about all those weeks.
So you really, this should have been higher,
Again, when this happens, that's a matter of
but
contention.
not in the same.
Probably not.
But in terms of this points that you've been making, the J and the E are not part of this.
No, they're not. They're pre this whole
They are
Reformation.
representing the earlier
Exactly.
type of religion,
Exactly.
the
when
old-time religion.
and we get to P, we'll see. In fact, there's two layers in P, and the earlier part of P is also part of that earlier religion.
Right, and that's
It's
where
the
you get
later
all the-
part of P that is part of the reform from the P perspective. Okay. Before we end, I just want to point out on page 1 of what I've given you, I also gave you a connection of the actions of Josiah and Deuteronomy. Okay, so if you follow,
Where are we?
I went through, if you go through the story of page 1, if you follow the story of Josiah, you can correlate everything he did with a text in Deuteronomy. Okay? All right?
Yeah, that's
So the point is, one of the interesting things is look at G. Brought all the local shrine priests in Jerusalem, but did not let them officiate at sacrifice. Deuteronomy 18:6 says exactly the opposite, by the way. It's one area where Josiah, a later Deuteronomy changed its mind on the role
Which
of those
number?
priests. G.
J brought all of the shrines.
Yeah. Okay.
So what did it say in Deuteronomy?
That they're allowed to. They can come in and worship at the central shrine. They can function. They get the same privileges. But the point is, if you take a look, virtually everything he did can be correlated with something in Deuteronomy. Okay?
Maybe they already know there are going to be synagogues everywhere.
Anyway, what I want to do is we'll finish up Jeremiah. We'll then look at the main characteristics of the Deuteronomic covenantal religion, and then we'll move on to P, which I gave you a beginning of an outline in, but which I will be more elaborate with. Okay? So we'll see you next week.